before talking about what if England had remained Catholic, we have to first talk about, what was the Protestant Reformation. So, long story short, you had people like Martin Luther in Germany, like complaining about church practices, and people were kind of critiquing how the Catholic Church ran itself as well. There was lots of corruption, there was lots of people paying to have like their sins forgiven and stuff, etc. There was a whole lot of different things that people were critical of. And the fact that the church made it so that the Bible could only be translated into Latin and had to be read in Latin meant that the only people who had access to what the Bible was saying were the Catholic priests, right? So, so the only people who could then interpret it were the priests. So all power with regard to like the spiritual was held within the priesthood. So what the Protestant Reformation was trying to do was to break this down. They wanted the Bible, for instance, to be translated into the native tongue of the people who are reading it, and they wanted it to be on a personal level so that any man or woman could read the Bible for themselves and then could interpret scripture for their own selves, without having to be dependent on this kind of like priestly middleman. And this movement was nothing new in England. So all the way back to like the 14th century with the likes of John Wycliffe, you had people known as the Lollards. So as you can see on the map here, they were quite widespread across like the whole of England. Basically, they wanted the Bible to be translated into English, and again, they were criticising a lot of things that would later come up in the Protestant Reformation many years before Martin Luther and the other ones did. So in a way, the kind of seeds for this kind of, people refer to it as proto-Protestantism, had already been kind of laid in England about 100 to 200 years before the Protestant Reformation really kicked off. And so the easiest way for this to happen is either for Henry VIII to have a son with Catherine of Aragon, but that's quite unlikely because she spent like 20 years trying to have a son and it just wasn't working. Or he could have just got over that and just been like, alright, cool. Because what ended up happening in a roundabout way anyway was that he ended up having a son. That son was very sickly, and his eldest daughter, Mary I, ended up becoming the first Queen of England anyway. So, so within our own timeline, she became like the rightful heir. So he kind of broke from the entire church and completely separated England from like Catholicism and etc., etc., all for your daughter to eventually get the throne anyway. So it was kind of, it wasn't really, So if that had happened, that would have meant that, at least on a legitimate level, Elizabeth I would never have been born, because Anne Boleyn, obviously Henry VIII was having an affair with Anne Boleyn, and the whole reason why he broke from Rome and set up the Church of England was because he wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon in order to marry Anne Boleyn, in the hope that Anne Boleyn would give him a son. However, obviously the Pope refused, and that's when he was like, well, I'll set up my own church then. So if he hadn't, had this kind of mindset and stuff, then he would have just been like, okay, cool, and just, So in that regard, Elizabeth I would never have been born. And obviously we think about the huge influence that she had on English culture, etc., etc. You also think about the Spanish Armada, which came many years later. That would never have happened. On a domestic level as well, the destruction of the monasteries, which is something that Henry VIII really kind of clamped down on as well, because he wanted to destroy the power of the church in the country. And also something as well, which I didn't really know much before doing this research, there was obviously, we tend to focus a lot on like the monarchy itself in this era, and we tend to focus a lot on what was happening with like royalty, but we don't tend to focus so much on what's happening to like the people's history of England during this time. And what I didn't know was that during this time there's something known as the Lincolnshire uprising, right? So this was a lot of people in the north of England and in the west of England and in Wales still held on to their Catholic faith. So while you can see on the map here, a lot of people in the south and the east of England were predominantly Protestant, a lot of people in the north, west and in Wales, they held on to their Catholic faith. And so when the monasteries were being destroyed, a lot of people in the north of England rose up against Henry VIII and actually, so they had to be crushed. So what we have to understand with the Protestant Reformation is this. Across Europe, in particular in France and in Germany, it was a disastrous affair, right? So in France, you had many civil wars about it, and this eventually led to the French Huguenots or French Protestants being expelled to England. And then also Germany itself ended up going through the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, and this was such a devastating conflict that it's estimated about 40% of the German population were wiped out because of this. So it was incredibly deadly. And, never mind all the diseases, etc., and everything, right? So the whole of Europe was thrown into turmoil as a result of the Reformation and then the later Counter-Reformation, which tried to reverse some of this. So it's something to kind of note that England transitioned relatively peacefully in the grand scheme of things from Catholic to Protestant. Whereas if this hadn't happened, you would have had a similar situation to what you had in France and many other places, where you had a Catholic monarch, a Catholic ruling class, but then many of the people themselves being Protestant. So this would have led to civil war and to destruction in many regards. Because even with Elizabeth I, yeah, you had the Common Book of Prayer, and this tried to kind of be a bit of a kind of compromise stuff, because many people in England were critical of the Anglican Church. So you had the Catholics, obviously, who were like, this is heresy, and then you also had many of the Protestants, in particular like the Puritans, who criticised the Anglican Church for being too Catholic. For those who have ever gone into an Anglican church, you will see that the decorations, for instance, are a little bit plainer than they are in Catholic churches, but they still have a lot more pomp and like decorative stuff than they do in other Protestant denominations. So other Protestant denominations, in particular Lutheran ones, are very plain, very austere, and that's just like a very physical like interpretation of it. But the idea that the churches on the continent, the Protestant churches on the continent, were very like austere, and you see this as well in Scotland, where Calvinism and Lutheranism became like really dominant and stuff. It's like the churches there are very like bland, right? No disrespect to them. So many people in England were already kind of split between Catholics on one side and then Puritans on the other side, and then the Anglican Church kind of stuck in the middle, trying to like be a compromise between all of them. It's also something to note that in the grand scheme of things, English nationalism, English national identity is defined by this moment. Like the break from Rome, as David Starkey has said, is kind of like the original Brexit, right? It's the original time at which England stands alone, separate from the rest of the continent, and is defined as being not French, not Spanish, not Italian, not Irish, right? Us kind of standing alone with our own church, separated from the continent by the sea. This is kind of the real forging of the English national identity. We even see, with the Bible being translated now into English, you see a standardization of the English language. So as we discussed in our previous videos about German unification, English was made up of multiple different dialects across the different counties and regions of the country, and Henry VIII helped to regiment like kind of the English language and to mould national sense of identity. And you see this obviously with Elizabeth I, with the Spanish Armada, and you see this in the writings of William Shakespeare. And again, it's this building of an English national identity, which kind of really takes place in this timeline. So if England had remained Catholic, it would have just been another Catholic country. So it's not to say that they would have had no national sense of identity, but it would have been a lot weaker if this hadn't have happened. If there hadn't been English Protestant Reformation, the country wouldn't have been as unified, because a big part of forming a national identity is not just talking about who you are, but it's also emphasizing who you're not. So for instance, the perfect example of this would have been what would have happened to the plantations of Ireland, right? So plantation of Ireland, in particular the plantations in Ulster, this was a move by Protestant kings to try and settle Ireland. So getting Protestants from England and from Scotland to settle in Ireland and to basically turn Ireland into a Protestant nation. And like these plantations did start with the Catholic Queen Mary. However, they end up very quickly taking on like Protestant nature. So so would there have been as much of a drive? Would there have been as much of a like certainly all the kind of troubles that happen in like Northern Ireland and stuff, would they have really happened in this timeline? Probably not, because there would have been no mass exodus of Protestants kind of leaving there to live in Ireland, which would, So this timeline is very different, and it's something to note that the whole of like English and like British history would completely be turned on its head. And to talk about it for the rest of the world, you know, a big part of why Protestantism is quite a dominant like kind of branch of Christianity around the world is as a result of the British Empire. So if you'd had no English Reformation, the Protestant world would have been restricted to pretty much like the northern Germanic like kind of world. Yeah, so talking like northern Germany, Holland, like Scandinavian stuff, and it wouldn't have really spread out beyond that little narrow section.